Thank you for taking the time to be with us at C3. We hope you enjoy today's message.
Last week we completed our series on 1 John, and this week we begin a new one on the book of Exodus. So if you would turn all the way back, pretty easy book to find. It's the second one in the Bible, and so all you got to do is go to the beginning and flip a book ahead. We are looking at a series we're entitling We're Outta Here. And so this morning we're going to introduce that to you and talk a little bit about what Exodus is all about and some of the history, because Exodus, the story of Exodus, is also our story. And Exodus, maybe more than any other Old Testament book, plays out continually throughout the Gospels. It's mentioned in every Gospel. It's mentioned by Jesus Christ, who becomes our one-time-for-all deliverer. It's also referred to in the book of Revelation. You're going to constantly hear references about this book. I have never, to be honest with you, ever taught out of Exodus. I think we've done Bible studies in the past, a little bit on parts of it, but we've never done it start to finish. So that's our attempt. And looking, the staff asked me, how long do you think this will take? And I said, well, I won't retire, I don't believe, before it's over. But it could be somewhere between 35 weeks to 40 weeks, maybe. So it's not necessarily going to be verse by verse, but it's going to cover a good portion of it. So this morning, as you know, the hardest day when you start a new series is the first day, because you want to give kind of a panoramic view. And Exodus really is a book that is very interesting, because it talks about the nation of Israel as Israel is established, and what happens to Israel, as well as how God gets personally involved in the affairs of a nation that is very small, very weak. And then it's also going to look at this from the perspective as how does world powers really treat the people of God? How do they relate? And why is it that throughout history there has always been an attempt to eradicate from the planet the Jewish nation? Well, we're going to find that in its very beginning this morning, and how that was actually instituted by the world power of the day. Exodus is important for a couple of reasons, and really, I've listed three in your outline, as to, well, why Exodus? What can we possibly learn from the Exodus story and the narrative itself? Three reasons. Number one, all of us need to understand this. We need to know God better, and in a much deeper level than we currently do. As a matter of fact, the psalmist in Psalm 66 writes these words in relation to Exodus and the story and what God is doing in and among the people. He says, "Come and see the wonders of God. His acts of humanity are awe-inspiring. He turned the sea into dry land, and they crossed the river on foot. There on the other side we rejoiced in him. He rules forever by his might, and he keeps his eyes on the nations. The rebellious should never exalt themselves." Come and see is an invitation to see God getting actually personally involved in the affairs. If you ever notice, throughout the journey of Exodus and into the promised land, the develop of Israel, they always are referring back to this. Even in Jesus' day, one of the Pharisees, the group that really did the teaching at that time, constantly is referring back to the law, trying to hold on to this time period, trying to hold on to the truth, saying this is our history. As much as there is a downside to what the Pharisees did, one of the things that was very positive in this particular group is they realized that throughout history they were a distinctive people, and that they needed to hold on to their distinctive. one of the things that as a church we need to remind ourselves is to constantly return to who we are as individuals, as the people of God that are born again through Jesus Christ's death on the cross and his Spirit living in us. That we have to make sure, like Israel, that the distinctive that we hold as the people of God is never compromised or assimilated into the culture. It doesn't mean that we can't look like the culture, we live in the culture, all of that. It means that we do not become part of the culture in how we live, how we believe, how we relate, how we deal with other people's, and you're going to find that throughout this entire story. So we need to learn God better. The second thing that Exodus is going to help us with is this, that we need to understand the whole process of redemption, of what it looks like in deliverance, what it looks like in rescue, in salvation, in provision, in protection, in trust. That this whole journey is an incredible, awe-inspiring, almost out of this world aspect on how God comes and literally leads Israel out of its captivity, out of its bondage. And the fact that the whole process itself is important. When you think about Jesus on the road to Emmaus, and he comes upon a couple of disciples who were walking away from Jerusalem. And he walks alongside and he's talking to them and he asks them, what are you guys doing and where are you going? And they're like, haven't you heard what happened? And he says, no. And so they tell him about, we had put our hope and faith in Jesus Christ. We believed that he was the Messiah, but they crucified him. But some weird things have happened. And there were some ladies that had said that he has been raised from the dead and that he was going on ahead. And all of a sudden, Luke lets us know that Jesus then begins to talk to him. And where does he go? He starts at Exodus. He starts with Moses, goes all the way through the prophets. He retells the story of God's plan. And their response was, our hearts, something in us, our very essence, our personality, our will, our intellect, our emotions burned with passion. There's something about retelling the story that does something to us in the rekindling of how important this whole aspect of redemption, of deliverance, of salvation, of protection, of provision really is, which inspires us to do the thing that we're mostly afraid of as human beings, and that is to trust in something or someone we cannot see. Because our story isn't written, and it's fine. We're living our story. It's easy to look back at the Exodus story and go, what a bunch of idiots Israel really was. Because we're reading their story. We know how it ends, but we don't know how our story. And so redemption in real time and real life is hard to live out when it involves you trusting and risking your own life. And then third, well, not only are we in a place where we need to know God a little bit better, a little bit deeper, but redemption a little bit better, but also then we need to understand how this plays out in our real life. What are the lessons that we can take from this and put in our community, in our daily lives, in our family? For example, taking care of the unborn. We're going to find how important that really is. The first time that an attempt at a national genocide was ever recorded on in human history was during this time. So the importance of what happens with the unborn, the importance of community, and what role community really plays. How, as a group of people, do we maintain our distinctive and then learn to play nice together? Especially, now they're the great ones, of playing nice in a great sandbox called the desert for about 40 years. They don't always do that, There's a lot of fighting. There's a lot of power jockeying. There's a lot of, I don't like him. I don't like him. At one point in time, the earth actually opens up and people get swallowed up. There's just crazy stuff that goes on. But the importance of what community does for us on the journey of going to the promised land. Also, the importance of relying on God's presence and provision daily. You know, you're going to see that happen when they leave Egypt, and how God continually provides everything and reminds them that he's right there. And what that looks like, and what that looks like on a daily basis. Because for us, it's just as easy to get so caught up in our daily life and all the things that we do, that we have a tendency just to become very familiar with God and very complacent in our relationship with him. Our relationship with God is not a one-sided thing. It starts that way, and that's what Exodus will show us. It becomes a very one-sided, that God's going to do some certain things, but in some of the subtext that we'll talk a little bit, you're always going to see God doing something and then stepping back, and the second time that it has to happen with the individual participating in doing something. And that's our life with Jesus Christ. Our life with God is one, he does something we can't do. He comes and saves us. From that point on, when it involves our journeying with him to the promised land or into the new earth, into the new Jerusalem, into the new heavens, there is something that we are expected to do on a daily basis. And that is to trust and to engage him. Jesus calls it remaining or abiding in him. Because on this journey, we're going to find there are a lot of things that are going to try to stop your progress, to try to hold up and create detours and try to get you lost on the journey. And that's Israel's history, and it's ours as well. Also, we're going to find the importance of obeying his word, the importance of worship in our daily and corporate lives. You know, and examining that. What does my daily worship look like? Well, in the New Testament, my daily worship, it looks like this. Here's my life today, and my priority is to do your priority, which is to love you with all of my heart, with all of my mind, with all of my soul, with all of my strength, and to love other people the way that you love them and the way that I love myself. So I'm not to look out only for my own interests and so engage this culture with me first, and get as much as I can and become a consumer and an acquirer, but I'm to look out for other people. I'm to be a person that is very culturally subversive. That when people look, you're almost a conundrum to them because you are a person who turns the other cheek. You're a person that loves an enemy. You're a person that engages people who disagree. We don't give based on what we get. We give with the left hand not knowing what the right hand does. Today, we live in a world that if I give something, I want to know what my money's doing. Jesus says you give it and you leave it alone. You know, we are to be people that are involved in social justice, not just church aspect. And so our orthodox is really important, but our orthoprax, Jesus would say, or the practice of our orthodox is even more important. Because we can't be the people that will say, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name? Didn't we study your Bible? Didn't we gather every Sunday? Didn't we pray? He's going to say, yeah, that's all great. But what? There were plenty of people that needed a cup of cold water. There were plenty of people that needed visitation. There were plenty of people that were down and out. There were plenty of people that actually hated, and you didn't do any of that. So the practice of this is really what Israel was to do, that Jesus comes in the flesh as God and teaches again the world to say, this is how the kingdom really operates. And that's what you are on a journey into something completely new, something completely different. Something that the world looks at and goes, this is so different than the conventional wisdom of our day. and the norms of our day that we're intrigued with it. So tell us more. And so all of that is important. Finally, obviously, Israel is going to be a nation that's going to really struggle with the encouragement, the commandment, the rule to avoid idols. Things that can replace God as the top priority in your life. Because everybody's trying to explain during this period of time, and Exodus is no different. So if every nation has their own God and their own worship system, how is there then only one God? And so God comes and introduces himself, as we'll find, to Abraham and takes him out of a polytheistic nation and says, I am the only living God. I am the uncreated creator. Or in our vernacular, I am the Big Bang. When I said let there be, there was such an explosion of life that things started to happen, that night and day occur, and darkness and light, they separate, and all of a sudden there's this form, and stars are put in the sky, and planets and galaxies, and all of that are coming along, and I put my attention on one. And from that, I begin to create and create and create and create. I am the uncreated. I always have been. I am that I am. And I am now involved in your life. And so this whole story becomes intriguing to say, God is one who says, I don't want you to cheat yourself for what's fake. You know, there's a big movement in our world today from our president referring to the news as fake news. Well, the same thing happens here. There's all kind of fake news when it comes to God. There's all kind of things and that's really what an idol is. It's something that's fake. It's not real. It's made by man. Therefore, it is subservient to man. But the uncreated God is the one who wants to know that I am here for your best, and I have your best in my mind. I'm the God that is slow to anger and abounding in love, as he will introduce himself to Moses as we walk through this. So let's take a look then at Exodus as a text before we jump into this. There are, as I said, a main text, and then there's a lot of subtext or a lot of little stories that constantly are making the main text kind of come alive, that we can read over the story and go, oh, I missed that. Oh, geez, I missed that. Oh, I missed that. Gee, I missed that. There are so many things that happen that are reproduced throughout human history that take place over and over again throughout this story and narrative of the great Exodus. Well, the main, obviously, is how the Israelites end up as indentured servants, or really slaves, and then how God comes to deliver them with unbelievable wonders, miracles, signs. And with that, you have to understand this. Israel plays no part in the process of the deliverance. This is all God. They have really nothing to do. And Israel is kind of stuck in a tug of war, aren't they? We're going to find that Israel is completely controlled by Pharaoh, or the ruling elite, the government of Egypt. The word Pharaoh means great house, much like the White House. It's a descriptive term that talks about where the person lives. And so the Pharaoh at that point in time is looking, and he's saying, look, I want to control, and we'll read why he's afraid of these people and what that means. And then they are also, this people is completely controlled by God. And so the text that you'll hear is, in the beginning of the book, is what? Let my people go. No, I won't let them go. Let my people go. No, I won't let them go. Let my people go so they can come and worship me. I'm not letting you go. Why? Because I need you in order to continue as the most powerful nation in the world. And so your cheap labor and I'm worried about you, so you're not going anywhere because you know what? I've learned how to make a lot of money off of you. And so God comes and says, I did not create people, especially my people, to live this way, to live under a justice, to live under oppression, to live in poverty, to live with restriction. I created my people to be free. Free to worship, free in their worship, to be completely provided for, to live and to what? Reproduce the advancement of my kingdom on this earth. So if you take that group of people and you pour injustice over them, then I'm going to come and I'm going to get involved. And then we're going to find out which God is really God. And that's the beginning kind of story that happens here. Now, a lot of subtext, which really is a way that there's kind of a double narrative going on in the story. So you can't just read this in just literal line by line by line by line by line by line and go, okay, because God says it, therefore it's so, and I believe it kind of a thing. There's a lot of stuff going on that have all kind of historical throughout human history relevance, and that you see repeated over and over and over and over. As a historian, one of the things that I am a very, very big believer in is that history might change based on the people in the time, but the cycle will always repeat itself. Same thing with everything in nature. I mean, the nature, you can chart the sun if you want. The sun will put out great production periods, then the sun will put out a lower production period. You read anything from NASA, the sun right now, the output of the sun is at one of its lower times right now, one of the lower outputs, and I'll have no problem going, okay, you can tell that. And they said that the sun's output really started to reduce around the year 2016, and they believe the next cycle will go from like 2016 to about 2024. So guess what's going to happen? Winters get a little colder. Anybody notice winters getting a little colder? A little snowier? Well, that's just part of the cycle. The output goes down, and then the output goes back up. And so the world isn't warming, the world's cooling a little bit, by... If you look at it by like 1.1 ever degree, and it has great, play in the world. Well, the history of our world and civilization always cycles through, and you're going to find a lot of this cycling through human history as well. And you'll even find the story of Exodus being used over and over again. I mean, if you go into the 17th century, into the 1600s, you're going to find that a group of people in both Europe and Great Britain looked at the current condition with how they were being ruled by the king and said, you know what? Our religious freedom is being struggled. And so, you know what? We're going to risk everything. We're going to jump on a boat and we're going to go to another land. And that's how America really was started. And the backdrop of all of that was the story of Exodus. Martin Luther King, if you ever read anything about Martin Luther King, the I Have a Dream speech is taken directly from Exodus. As a matter of fact, the night before he was assassinated, he said, I stand on a hill and I look out over something that I'm not going to be allowed to probably enter. Where does he get that from? He gets that from Moses standing on a hill, looking at the promised land, knowing that he wasn't allowed to enter. And the next day, Martin Luther King was shot. You see the cycles constantly being repeated throughout human history. So it's something I think that is really important. Some of the other subtext is, a lot of things in this book happen in twos, by the way. As I said, God will do something, and then the second time, he kind of works with the individuals. For example, at the Red Sea, we'll look at the story and we'll kind of set this up. Here's Israel. They're out. They get to the Red Sea. They look, and all of a sudden you see, and if anybody, if you watch Cecil B. DeMille's, 10 Commandments, you see the whole line of the chariots coming, and they're like looking, and the Red Sea's there, and it's all crazy, and what are we going to do, and what are we going to do, and, the pillar of fire comes, and all of a sudden, all night long, the Red Sea opens. Well, what does God do? Israel doesn't have to even swing a fist. They have no weapons. God destroys the armies of Pharaoh, all the chariots in the Red Sea. They do nothing except cross. However, the next time that they fight a group called the Amalekites, who will be one of the greatest enemies that Israel will ever face. And they have to fight, but they have to fight themselves. Now, God is with them. You'll watch the whole battle itself. We'll talk a little bit about. But now they get to repeat the victory, but now they are participating in what they watch God do. You'll find the same thing in how the commandments are given. It comes in a set of two. First one, before the golden calf, Moses goes up, spends 40 days on the mountain. Everybody panics, thinks that God killed them. So they turn into, kind of a crazy, drunken orgy fest. And what are they doing? They're replicating the culture they came from. And they fashion a God from the culture they came from. To say, you know what? This is our God. Moses comes down, sees it. You see the whole smashing of the commandments, goes back up, gets a second set. Same thing with the glory of God. The first time on Mount Sinai when they're there, God speaks. The next time you see the glory is when the tabernacle is established in the promised land. Happens over and over and over again with the book itself. Let's take a look now at Exodus in our beginning here, as hopefully you have a little bit of sense of where we're going to go. Exodus chapter 1, verse 1. And we're going to be looking at the people, the places, as well as the time frame that all of this is happening. It says, now these are the names of the sons of Israel. Now we need to stop there, because in order to understand Exodus, you have to understand how the Pentateuch in the Greek or the Torah in the Hebrew was written. This is a continuation of Genesis. This is like part 2. Actually, the book would read, and now these are the names. So you kind of have to work your way backwards. So I want you to go to Genesis chapter 12 so we can set the stage. Otherwise, you can kind of read through it and go, I don't quite get this a little bit. So if you go to Genesis chapter 12, and we're going to find how the story begins. The people find their beginning, I should say, with a guy named Abram. In chapter 12, verse 1, we read, now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and so shall you be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you, and in all of your families of the earth you will be blessed. And we know Abram obeys, and he's off and journeying. So here's this guy. He is a polytheist. He is from the land of Ur, which is the Iraqi part of the world, and he's going to migrate. So he is now going to be a guy that God is handpicking. He's not really all that important. He's kind of an ordinary guy, much like us. Kind of the story that God uses ordinary people, and when God blesses, he does some amazing things with his presence on it. And so Abraham goes. Abraham's going to take his wife, he's going to take his nephew Lot, and they're going to start heading out. Now, the problem is that God is going to say to Abraham, or to Abram at this point in time, I'm going to make a great nation of you. Abraham is married to a woman who can't have kids, Sarah. And so he says, okay, well, how's this going to work? The promise comes to Abram that, look, you are going to have a kid. We know the history. They're waiting for all this to happen. He gets to be about 100. Sarah somewhere around 90. Prior to that, Ishmael is born, and which gives you the lesson what happens when we try to run ahead of God. There's always something that comes up that's very worldly. It doesn't end well, and it usually ends up attacking the things of God anyway. And so they finally do Ishmael and Abraham. Ishmael's trying to control Abraham, picks on Abraham. Sarah gets mad. Before you know it, Hagar and Ishmael are sent away, and now God is going to deal with them and build a nation through them, but his focus is going to be on Abram. And so flip up to chapter 15 as we're moving through history at a record pace. And so in chapter 15, what we're going to find beginning in verse 12 says, now, when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, terror and a great darkness fell upon him. And God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, that they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years, but I will judge the nation whom they serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. Then in the fourth generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. So, we know the story, has a kid, has a son named Isaac. He's asked to sacrifice the son. Why? Is a picture of God being so wonderful and loving that he would not withhold anything from his creation, including his son. And so as a picture of what Jesus Christ will do, Abraham is asked to sacrifice the thing that is most near and dear to him, a son in his old age. That is stopped, and Isaac begins to grow. They find a wife for Isaac. Isaac has two children, Esau and Jacob. Jacob begins to grow, and Jacob and Esau, they don't get along. Jacob steals the birthright. Esau's going to kill him. Jacob flees. Where does he head? He heads out towards the Midianites, and he meets and goes to an uncle of the family named Laban, who is a scoundrel, and makes him work 7 years for the girl of his dreams, right? Rachel. Unfortunately, quick switch on the wedding night, in slips Leah, and he wakes up the next morning and goes, what did you do? Now I'm married, but I didn't want her. I didn't want the ugly sister. I wanted the hot sister. And now what? And so Laban says, you got to work another 7 years, gets Rachel. They all have a bunch of kids. And the pride and joy of Jacob comes at an old age in when Joseph is born. Joseph is a spoiled little kid, grows up, but he's also a gifted child. He is one who has the ability to see and interpret dreams. And so he has a lot of dreams about what's going to happen in the future, directly related to what God told Abraham. He likes to tell it to his brothers. His brothers hate his guts because he's got the cool coat. And so he's got this cool coat with a whole bunch of colors that his dad made, and he shows it off. He never likes to get it dirty, and he goes out all the time to watch his brothers, and he goes back and tells his dad that all my brothers are a bunch of slackers and are not getting the job done. And so dad goes out and yells at them. They come and they want to just kill Joseph. So one day Joseph goes out. We know the story. They're going to kill him. They decide not to. They make some money off him. They sell him. He goes to Egypt. In Egypt, he lives with a man named Potiphar. His wife likes him. His wife wants to sleep with him. He's a high man of integrity, which in of itself, coming from what he did, he was able to deal with all the abuse, all the offense, all the rejection. He didn't let it define him. He let his faith define him. So he didn't use that as an excuse to do whatever he wanted and to say, it's not my fault. You don't understand what kind of dysfunction I came from. He is a man who follows God. And as a result, for all his faithfulness, he's thrown in jail. So, in jail, he gets to interpret a couple dreams, meets a baker, meets a cook. One's going to get hung, one's going to survive, but they forget about him. He's now going from about 16 to about 30, lived a lot of time in prison, and now there is a problem. The Pharaoh at that time has a dream, and he sees a bunch of fat cows, and he sees a bunch of skinny cows. The skinny cows come out, eat some fat cows, and he's like, what's going on? Nobody can interpret. And the baker says, hey, I remember this dude down in the prison. He could interpret dreams. So they bring him, they clean him, they shave him up, they make him look really nice. And he tells the dream, and he says, hey, there's going to be a famine. Huge famine. And so here's what I suggest. As a result of him saying, look, let's build storehouses, and everybody's going to come and buy from you, and all your land's going to expand. You're going to be the most powerful nation in the world that the world has ever seen. He says, you know what? I like this kid. He can make me a whole lot of money. I don't care what race you are. I don't care what nationality you are. Put this, clean him up, and you know what? You're now in charge of this. And so all of this happens. Meanwhile, back at the ranch in the promised land, here is now Jacob and his family, and they're starving. And so he tells the boys, go to Egypt. They meet Joseph. Joseph reveals himself and says, look, this had nothing to do with you. This was God bringing a plan to pass to save a nation and our family. And so what I want you to do is go get Dad and everybody and bring them here, and we're going to live here. There's Genesis. So With that, what you find, go to the last chapter of Genesis. Otherwise, none of this really makes all that much of sense. You think it's just an independent story. You come to the place where Joseph, at a ripe old age, in verse 22 of chapter 50, now Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's sons, and the sons of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were born on Joseph's knees. Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised an oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. Exodus chapter 1. And now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, and all the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. Joseph died and all his brothers in that generation, but the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and came be exceedingly mighty, so that the land was full of them. So they start with 1, they become 70, they move to Egypt, and they become a nation. Time is passing. So a couple questions that this poses for us right here is, at the time of the Exodus, Israel now would be about, they estimate, about 600,000 men, plus women and children. So anywhere from 1.2 to 1.5 million people. And if you do the math, that's about right, because about every 30 years the population doubles. Has been from the history of this all the way through. Population just kind of doubles, whether it's 25, 30, 35 years, it just keeps doubling. And you can see that from our age, everybody here, our population in the world has doubled. It has gone from about I think we're now at 7 billion people. So it just continually is advancing and moving. But here's the question. Why did God send Israel to Egypt? Abraham goes there during a famine. Israel goes there, but Israel stays there. Why do they stay there? And why were they sent there? If they were already in the promised land, why did they have to be sent out of the promised land to come back to the promised land? I don't know if you read like I do, but that's the first thing I'm like, okay, you could have circumvented hundreds of years of history by just leaving them there because of this. 70 people would have never survived. They would have been absorbed or murdered or killed by the Amorite, Amalekite, Jebusite, and every otherite that lived in the Canaanite land, right? Also, good chance that they would have intermarried. So what God does is he uses the one nation in the world that will function as an incubator for his family, for his children. Much like with a premature baby, you put them in an incubator and everything there to sustain life and grow is possible. Egypt becomes the perfect place for their land. They were given the best land in the delta to grow, and they would be completely left alone because of the way the Egyptian political system, religious system operated. They believed that Pharaoh was not a god, but was the God. And therefore, the bloodline flowed down through Pharaoh and through the nation itself. So the one thing that the Egyptians would never do is they wanted to keep their bloodline pure. They would never intermarry. And so the perfect place for 70 to become 140, 280, 520, whatever, onto and onto and onto, was the land of Egypt. See, the great thing about all this is God always knows what he's doing. And so they will grow, and they will be taken care of. And it's all a result that reminds us what? That God sees outside of time. When Joseph was a young man, he saw all of human history and knew that I'm going to move him here. This will happen. This will grow. This will take place. All of this is going to happen. That is going to ultimately show the world that I am the one and only true God, that I am the uncreated creator. And so the narrative of the story is really, really neat. So, verse 8, from freedom to slavery. And then we'll close here. It says, now a new king arose over Egypt who didn't know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more mightier than we are. Come, let us deal wisely or shrewdly, depending on your translation, with them. Or else they will multiply in the event of war. They'll also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land. So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor. And they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. This is the most powerful nation in the world, is now in dread of Israel. Kind of interesting. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks and all kinds of labor in the field, and their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. Then the king said, second policy, spoke to the Hebrew midwives, or the midwives to the Hebrews. Not really sure whether these are Hebrew or whether they're Egyptian. I tend to believe they're Egyptian because of how the story unfolds. One of whom was named Shiphrah, the other who was named Puah. And he said, when you're helping the Hebrew women to give birth and to see them upon the birth stool, if they are born a son to them, then you shall put the son to death. But if it's a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives, they feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said, what have you done this thing for? And let the boys live. Now the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they're vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. Basically, our women are just pretty much pampered and weak, and they fire kids out before we can even get there. And as a result of one of the first acts of civil disobedience the planet has ever seen, God rewards the sin of lying. Don't know why. Because. And the people multiply and become very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Then Pharaoh commanded all the people, saying, every son who is born, you are to take them and cast them into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. Third policy of this particular Pharaoh. And so here's how this story moves. New king comes to power. And he forgets about Joseph. How do you forget about Joseph? It's like forgetting about George Washington. When he was instrumental, he was the second in command. There would be things written all about this guy. So how do you forget about it? The answer to that? Time. Time is either a great friend or a great enemy of the distinctive of the people of God. And so the king forgets, and the Egyptians come to dread and hate the Israelites. And so they decide to oppress them. 400 years after having the best of the land, the best of the nation, the land and the nation turns on them. The lesson for us, just like them, is we are to put our faith and trust in God. Not what we have, not where we live, not what we eat. Because just like here, one of the dangers that we always face is prosperity. Prosperity erodes our distinctive if we're not careful. And so the Israelites assumed this was just going to be the norm for the remainder of their life. And that's not what God was looking, because God had created this people to be a voice to the nation. They had a mission. And so he's going to force the hand of the mission, and all the while pointing that he and only he is God, not Pharaoh. Meanwhile, here's how slavery comes in the form of. It comes in three areas. Political slavery. The king in verse 8 is going to deal shrewdly. He's panicking. He said, look, we can't have this. And so what they begin to do is they are going to conscript the people. Now, the slavery that the Israelites operate is not like, you can't use the American slavery model that was endured or in Great Britain during the slave trade. That doesn't work because that's not what they did. They were allowed to remain in their family. So husbands and wives weren't separated, kids weren't separated, men were taken and they were put to work, women were taken, they were put to work. At the end of the day, they came back to their house. So the taskmasters were almost like the person who was over so many families or over so many areas, and there was agriculture, there was construction, there was brick making, all of that. So it's just not like what you see in Cecily DeMille. They're out there just building, pyramids and all of that kind of stuff. They're doing everything in this particular area on all of that. And so the point, though, is the first thing that happens in this is what Pharaoh does is he removes any political freedom that the people have. And it's something that we have to be very careful and cautious with in the day in which we live. Because political freedoms are easily pulled away by the world power. Second area is economic slavery. Obviously, they were used for slave labor. There was a huge injustice that was put on. Their lives were bitter. But it's not the only time that this has ever worked. We live in a day today, by the way, where the second largest organized crime in the world is sex trafficking. Do you realize that they're estimating that just over 30 million people are enslaved in sex trafficking? And it's hard to even find stuff on it. It's just now beginning to emerge. There is a social injustice that is happening. And the reason is economics. Same that begins way back here in the book of Exodus. And the third is social slavery, which the king then starts to come out with, look, here's what we're going to do. We can't have this race continuing to advance, so let's kill the race. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to start killing all the males, and within 2 generations, all that's going to be left is women, and it's just going to die out with them. And it was the first attempt at genocide. We know that Herod will do this. We know that this will happen throughout human history all the way through the World War I's, World War II's, where there are numerous times that children were attempted to be wiped out. Well, in the midst of all of this, God raises up a couple people. And he raises up 2 women, who I believe are Egyptian women, by the way. Shiphrah and Puah. And they are going to be the ones that are going to be the first model of civil disobedience because they cared for humanity. And so they are going to out and out lie to the king, and they refused to murder. They looked at this and said, we can't do this, isn't right. And as a result, there's a baby by the name of Moses. And Moses will be spared. And the second person, or the third person really that's involved in civil disobedience, will be Pharaoh's own daughter. And so God will raise up a deliverer right in the midst of the most powerful nation of the world. It's a picture, guys, and we're going to stop here because we're out of time, how God continues to raise people up, how he raises up a church in the New Testament right in the midst of superpowers to hold to its distinctive, to its way of life, to hold on to its cultural norms, not to look in an ethnocentric way that we are superior because, not to look from anybody else to be its blessing, not to hold on to prosperity and to accept it, but to hold on and trust in Jesus Christ. That through us, that there is a mission and a gospel of good news that needs to go out into our world, and God continues to spare us and deliver us and lead us all the way into a promised land known as the new heavens and the new earth. That's what the story is going to go about. Next week, we're going to look at Moses. We're going to find out how he was born, what this means, how it applies to us. But this morning, that's the beginning. And that's where we're going over the next 40 weeks or so or less, whoever knows. But let's stand because we're out of time. You know, you look at all of this and you go, okay, well, how do we apply this? You know, what does this kind of mean for us this morning on a really hot day in July? Well, the first thing is this. God always calls people much like the midwives. Because our battle isn't against people. Our battle is for people. Thank God that these two women understood that. Also, it reminds all of us to cling to what Israel did in the very beginning, and that is, in our day, to stay connected to Jesus Christ. Not to wander away, not to become complacent, but to realize that our story, it's not finally written. That there is a lot of trust, there is a lot of obedience, there's a lot of faith in what we go through. And we're going to go through very similar trials as do the people of Israel in the Exodus. There's a lot of oppression, there's a lot of injustice that some of us are under. There's real enemies that we face that we talked about in 1 John. There is a real enemy that seeks to steal, kill, and destroy from you. And just like the Exodus, Satan cannot defeat the one he hates the most in the universe, and that's God. So the way he gets at God is he always goes at God's kids. It's the most disgusting form of hatred, of violence, of injustice, of enslavement, of captivity, of bondage, and of genocide that has ever been recorded, and it comes right from the pit of hell by the father of lies himself, and that's what we face. All of us walk around with a target. Every one of us is being looked at for possible destruction. And just like Israel, we have to trust and hold on to our faith that the one who has delivered us is now going to take us on a journey, and he is going to be our provider, our protector. He is the sole one that we worship. And so this morning, let's pray as we go. That Father, Lord, we thank you that we can begin something new, and we can look back thousands of years and find that the story of a nation is our story. That, Lord, that just like Israel, we need to follow you, not our own ideas, not our own culture, not the conventional wisdom of the day, but your wisdom. That comes, Lord, from looking at the examples of history and the truth of your word, but practicing that. So this morning I pray, Father, that you will just imprint this in our lives. And as we begin a journey, Lord, over the next weeks and months, that it would be one that helps us to understand the importance of redemption, that helps us to know you a little bit better, and helps us to stay focused and connected to you, Jesus Christ, our Savior. And for that, Lord, we thank you and we surrender our lives. And as we go this morning, I just ask that you bless us again and keep us, just like you did Israel, that you cause your face to shine upon us, that you would be gracious to us, forgiving to us, merciful to us, that you'll provide and protect each of us as we're on our journey throughout today and throughout this week until you bring us back next week as we continue to look at the journey of the Exodus and what a great deliverance and salvation you bring. And we ask all of this in Jesus' name, amen.